Hello everyone and welcome to the School of Apologetics. My name is Jordi and today we're going to be tackling Chapter 6. Chapter 6 talks about the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam. So now let's go into a little history about Muhammad. So Muhammad was born in AD 570 in Mecca to Abdullah and Amina. He was born into the Quraysh tribe, which was in control of the city of Mecca. Now, the Quraysh tribe was the custodian of the Kaaba and of the religious worship centered around it. He was a normal Arab boy who liked to talk a lot and spoke with those who traveled in caravans. The only thing that was unusual about his childhood was that he began to experience religious visitations. Yes, now one of his claims is that a heavenly being split open his stomach and then stirred his inside around and then sewed him back up. Those are one of his claims. Now, one possible explanation of these early religious episodes that Muhammad has was that he was epileptic or he had some sort of mental problem. Now, looking at his mother, Amina, she was of an excitable nature and often claimed that she was visited by spirits or jinns. She also at times claimed to have visions and religious experiences. His mother was involved in what we call today the occultic arts. And this basic orientation seemed to have been inherited by her son, Muhammad. Now let's look at the possibility of epilepsy, because anytime Muhammad was said to have had a vision from God, from Allah, he was always having a sort of epileptic episode. So what would happen is he would fall to the ground, his body would begin to jerk, his eyes would roll backward, and he would foam from the mouth and also perspire profusely. And they would often cover him with a blanket during these episodes. It was after this state that he would come back and say he had received a divine visitation, and then he would proclaim what had been handed down to him. In the Arab culture of Muhammad's day, epileptic seizures were interpreted as a religious sign of demonic possession or divine visitation. So Muhammad initially considered both options as possible interpretation of this experience. At first, he was worried about the possibility that he was demon-possessed. This led him to attempt to commit suicide. He was stopped by his devoted wife, who persuaded him that he was a good man and he could not possibly be demon-possessed. It should be noted that the possibility that Muhammad may have had specific epileptic seizures is very offensive to Muslims and even considered blasphemous. However, just as Muslims are free to interpret them as divine visitations, non-Muslims are free to interpret them as epileptic seizures, demon possessions, or an overactive imagination, fraud, religious hysteria, or whatever else gives them an adequate explanation of what Muhammad was experiencing. When we go into McClintock and Strong's encyclopedia, we read the following. Muhammad was endowed with a nervous constitution and a lively imagination. It was not at all unnatural for him to come after a time to regard himself as actually called of God to build up his people in a new faith. Muhammad, as we gather from the oldest and most trustworthy narratives, was an epileptic and as such was considered to be possessed of evil spirits. At first he believed the sayings, but gradually he came to the conclusion, confirmed by his friends, that demons had no power over so pure and pious a man as he was, and he conceived the idea that he was not controlled by evil spirits, but that he was visited by angels whom he disposed to hallucinations, a vision, an audition, afflicted with a morbid state of body and mind, saw in dreams. Or even while awake conceived he saw. What seemed to him good and true after such epileptic attacks, he esteemed revelation, in which he, at least in the first stage of his pathetic course, firmly believed, and which imparted to his pensive, variable character the necessary courage and endurance of all mortifications and perils. Now let's look at the religious background. The Quraysh tribe was particularly addicted to the cult of the moon god Allah. They had a peculiar fondness for his three daughters, who were called Alat, Aluza, and Manat. The fact that Muhammad's father was named Abdullah and his uncle Ubaydullah not only proves the pre-Islamic use of the word Allah, but also that Muhammad's family was deeply involved in the worship of the moon god, Allah and his three daughters. Muhammad grew up in Mecca, where the Kaaba shrine had at least 360 idols, and the sacred magical black stone, which was considered the good luck charm for the Quraysh tribe. He witnessed pilgrims coming to Mecca every year, where they would worship at the Kaaba by running around it 7 times, kissing the black stone, and then running to a nearby wadi to throw stones at the devil. It's no surprise that most of the elements of his religious upbringing were transferred into the religion of Islam and did not come from a new revelation from Allah to Muhammad. Now let's look at his first wife. His life was uneventful as a young man. At the age of 25, he was tending a caravan. The woman who owned it was 15 years older than him and a widow. She fell in love with him and married him. Together they had 2 sons that both died young and 4 daughters. One of the daughters married Uthman, who became the caliph, who later standardized the text of the Quran. After he married the wealthy widow, Muhammad lived a life of leisure, and his duties were limited to running the family produce stand in the market. So now he's called to be a prophet. While the term prophet was used in the hope that Jews would accept Muhammad as the next prophet, the term apostle was likewise used in the hope that Christians would acknowledge him as the next apostle. The Quran gives us 4 conflicting accounts of Muhammad's call to be a prophet. We are first told in Surah 53 verse 2 and Surah 81 verses 19 to 24 that Allah personally appeared to Muhammad in the form of a man, and that Muhammad saw and heard him. We are then told in Surah 16 verses 102 and Surah 26 verses 192 to 194 that Muhammad's call was issued by the Holy Spirit. This is the first contradiction. The third account of his original call is given in Surah 15:8, when we are told that the angels were the ones who came down to Muhammad and announced that Allah had called him to be a prophet. This account was later amended in Surah chapter 2 verse 97, so that it was only the angel Gabriel who issued the call to Muhammad and handed down the Quran to him. So which is which? All these conflicting reports of his call to being a prophet. Now let's look at the concept of Islamic revelation. The word revelation in Arabic literally means handed down. It means that the Quran did not come through or by any man, Muhammad included. The Quran only came to man, in this case, Muhammad. Thus, there are no human authors of the Quran. This is the claim. Allah speaks directly to man, and man is the receiver and not the originator of the Quran. Now, initially, after his initial religious experience, in which he felt to be called a prophet and apostle, Muhammad began to have serious doubts about his sanity. He was particularly frightened that he was demon-possessed, because the bodily characteristics connected with his trances seemed even to Muhammad to parallel those in his community who would fall down in fits. It was believed that they were possessed by devils. He became so depressed that he decided to commit suicide. But on his way to the place where he was going to kill himself, he fell once again into a seizure. At one point, the hostility against Muhammad was such that the people in Mecca had laid siege to a section of the city where Muhammad lived, and he faced a very difficult situation. Now let's look at some of the satanic verses. In order to appease his pagan family members and the members of the Quraysh tribe, he decided that the best thing to do was to admit that it was perfectly proper to pray to and worship the 3 daughters of Allah, Alat, Aluza, and Manat. This led to the famous satanic verses in which Muhammad, in a moment of weakness and supposedly under the inspiration of Satan, according to Muslim authorities, succumbed to the temptation to appease the pagan mobs in Mecca. And this can be found in Surah chapter 53 verse 19. Now when his disciples at Medina heard of Muhammad's fall into polytheism, that's the worship of more than one god, they rushed to him with rebukes and counsel. Muhammad would later claim that Gabriel himself had come down from heaven and rebuked him for allowing Satan to inspire him to concede to the Meccan worship of the daughters of Allah. And because of this ridicule and the hostility that was now growing, he left Mecca and went to Taif. Finding no success or converts in Taif, he decided to return to Mecca. And on his way back, according to the Quran, in Surah 46, verses 29 to 35 and 72 verses 1 to 28, Muhammad preached to and converted the jinn or the genies. And according to the Quran, the jinns in turn preached Islam to the people. Thus, the male and female spirits who inhabited the trees, the rocks, and the waters of Arabia were now Muslims and under the control of Muhammad. Muhammad once again left Mecca and this time moved to Medina, where his preaching was received. And while there, he realized that his family and tribe would not give up their worship of idols unless they were forced by physical violence to do so. Now, looking at his personal life, Muhammad had two great weaknesses. The first was that of greed. By looting caravans and Jewish settlements, he had masses of fabulous wealth for himself, his family, and his tribe. Secondly, his next greatest weakness was women. Although in the Quran he would limit his followers to having 4 wives, he himself took more than 4 wives and concubines. The question of the number of women with whom Muhammad was sexually involved with, either as wives, concubines, or devotees, was made a point of contention by the Jews in Muhammad's day. The Quran in Surah chapter 4 verse 3 forbids the taking of more than 4 wives. To take any more would be sinful. But look at the number of women in Muhammad's harem. They included Khadija, Sauda, Aisha, whom he married at 8 years old, Salama, Hafsa, Zainab, Jawahira, Habiba, Safiya, Maimuna, Fatima, Hind, Asma, Zainab, Habla, Asma, Mary, Rehana, Sharik, Maimuna, Zainab, a third one, and Kola. All these women, more than 20. Now, several observations need to be given about the above list. First, the first 16 women were wives. Second, numbers 17 and 18 were slaves or concubines. Third, the last 4 women were neither wives or slaves, but devout Muslim women who gave themselves to satisfy Muhammad's sexual desires. Fourth, Zainab of Jahsh was originally Muhammad's adopted son's wife. The fact that Muhammad took her for himself has been problematic to many people, Muslims included. Fifth, Aisha was only 8 or 9 years old when Muhammad took her to his bed. This facet of Muhammad's sexual appetite is particularly distressing to witnesses. Now, Muhammad's death. The traditional view is that his death was due to poisoning by a Jewish woman whose relatives were murdered in one of Muhammad's pogroms against the Jews. It is also true from the early biographers that Muhammad had no premonition of his own death. Thus, he had made no arrangements for a successor. He had not set up any kind of governmental bureaucracy to run things in the event of his death. Neither had he gathered or put together his various revelations into what is now known as the Quran. His death was sudden and gave him no time whatsoever to arrange his own affairs. This is why Islam was soon to break apart into warring sects, such as the Shiites versus the Sunnis. Chaos followed because Muhammad had not clearly spelled out what was to be done after his death. And in conclusion, the amazing genius and forceful personality of Muhammad enabled him to take a minor pagan cult of worship of the moon god Allah and turn it into the second largest religion in the world. This brings us to the end of chapter 6 of the School of Apologetics, the Prophet of Islam. Thank you for watching.